So you've made your homebrew. You've got beer, mead, cider, or wine in bottles and ready to age. But how should you store it? And how long should you age it? There are some benefits to aging your homebrew. Often it improves complexity, and a lot of those rough edges start to smooth out into something that's a little bit easier drinking. It's the result of environmental factors like the climate, the tides, and of course, some microchemistry going on with all those little molecules inside the bottle. But should things age for a long time? Does aging a homebrew lead to increasing returns the longer it sits? Well, no. Almost every homebrew you make is going to have a bell curve. For beers, the peak of that bell curve can be anywhere from 6 months to a year. For meads, wines, and ciders, you're looking at 2 years max. Generally, what you're making on the homebrew scale is not going to be meant for long-term aging, unless you're leaning into some very specific styles. But it's important to follow some best practices to make sure that once you do open those bottles, they taste as excellent as they possibly could. There are 2 different types of aging, bulk aging and bottle aging, and they both have their fanatics. Bulk aging is the practice of letting your entire brew age together in one vessel, like a carboy or a keg, and that allows more consistent aging because you are not subject to variation bottle to bottle. When you're ready to drink it, you bottle it. Bottle aging is different and has some advantages. You're getting it out of that bulk environment and into bottles, which is going to reduce the risk of oxidation. However, bottles move around, right? You might put one in the fridge, then take it out a few weeks later when you've decided you're actually not going to drink it. And that bottle gets mixed in with the rest of the bottles, and it might age differently because it's been exposed to different extremes. There's no perfect answer for which method is right for you, but in this video, we're going to talk about bottle aging. For most brews, it's going to be best to age in dark glass bottles. That's brown glass bottles specifically, especially when you're talking about beer, because brown is really the only color of beer bottle that's going to prevent UV exposure to the hops inside your beer, and UV can skunk your hops and ruin your beer. Beer is always stored upright, but if we're talking about mead or wine with corks, generally the consensus has always been, let's age it on its side. That keeps the cork wet, right? Well, studies and anecdotal research have shown that that's not necessarily the case. You can store corked bottles sitting upright and they're going to be just fine. Now, for long-term storage, like a decade or more, it can be helpful to store your bottles on their sides. However, you're going to be using different corks than we typically use on the homebrew level, called floor corks, and they are meant for that kind of long-term aging. But if you're just aging a bottle of mead or wine for 1 year to 2 years, it's perfectly okay to store them upright or on their sides. It really doesn't matter. And it's a great practice to store your brew in a cool environment. Not necessarily a refrigerated environment, but if you can keep it between about 50 and 55 degrees, that's the ideal storage temperature. Personally, I keep my homebrews in a wine shelf in the closet on the other side of this room, and they sit at around 65 degrees year-round with no ill effects. Aging has a positive impact on most homebrews. Those big, loud, in-your-face flavors tend to calm down, mellow, and meld, and become more cohesive. So the longer you can age something until it hits that peak of its bell curve, the better. But if you are doing that bulk aging thing we talked about earlier, be aware that it's going to have an increased risk of oxidation. You want to be monitoring your headspace, and you might be wanting to fill that headspace with inert gas, just to make sure you're not getting too much oxygen exposure just by letting it sit. For beer, I like to think about it this way. For most styles, once it's carbonated, it's ready to drink, and a few months after that, it's going to be nearly perfect. But for big beer styles like Barleywines, Stouts, really anything that you would consider putting into an oak cask for aging, longer aging of 1 year or more is generally going to be helpful to kind of mellow out that beer's profile. The best barley wine I ever made sat for 3 months in an oak cask and then another 2 years inside the bottle before I finally cracked one open. And it was perfect. So the big question then comes, when should I be opening my homebrew? And you're the only one who can answer that. What I like to do is bottle several bottles in smaller bottles. Say I'm making a big, robust, fruited mead with lots of spices. That's going to need some time to age. And so generally, I'll put a bunch of it in these little tiny bottles so I can open one every few months without wasting an entire 750 milliliter bottle every time I want to see how that mead is doing. But one thing I love to do is hide a bottle from myself and just agree to myself that I'm not going to open it for at least 2 years. So that way, if the entire rest of the batch is gone, I still get an idea of how that brew tasted after a nice long-term aging. And sometimes it's well past the peak of its bell curve, but other times it's much better than I ever anticipated it could have been, and then I know for the next time I brew it how long I should likely age it. We're curious to hear from you all. How do you store your mead, wine, beer, or cider? And how long do you typically age your brews for? Drop a comment and let us know. We always love to read your insights. And make sure you hit that subscribe button below this video so you don't miss any of the upcoming content from us here at CraftaBrew. I'm BC, and until next time, I hope you have good things brewing.